Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This video is our final video in the instrument training series for Microsoft Flight Simulator. In this video, we'll take a look at what a real-world instrument check ride looks like. We'll look at the eligibility requirements for getting an instrument rating and then take a look at the process you would go through in the real world to take your oral and practical or flight test for the rating. If you enjoy the video, make sure to toggle the like button, share the video with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. This helps the channel grow and produce more high-quality flight simulator tutorial content. Before we begin this video, you'll want to check out the instrument training playlist on this channel if you haven't already done so. It contains videos on all the topics you'll need to master instrument flying in Flight Simulator, including basic attitude instrument flying, instrument procedures like procedure turns and holding patterns, instrument departures and arrivals, and all the various instrument approach procedures you can fly as an instrument pilot, as well as how to deal with instrument failures in both analog and glass cockpit aircraft. Whether you're looking to learn the basics of instrument flying or just looking for a refresher on one of the types of instrument approach procedures, this video series has you covered. I'll leave a link to that playlist in this video's description. Just like private pilot training, instrument training in the U.S. concludes with a test or check ride where you demonstrate that you have adequate knowledge and proficiency to safely exercise the privileges of the instrument rating you've been training for. And just like with a private pilot check ride, the instrument ride in the U.S. can be conducted by an FAA inspector, but in most cases is conducted by an FAA-selected designated pilot examiner or DPE. Like most check rides, the instrument ride is divided into two different phases. There is an oral exam where the examiner will test your knowledge to make sure you know what you need to know to safely operate the aircraft under IFR, and a practical exam where you'll go fly the airplane with an examiner to demonstrate that you have sufficient mastery of the skills you'll need to safely fly under IFR. In the real world, the practical portion is typically conducted in an airplane in visual conditions using a view-limiting device such as an IFR hood or foggles, as very few examiners are willing to let an unrated pilot take them into the clouds. Like all check rides, the instrument ride is conducted using the Airman Certification Standards, or ACS, for the instrument airplane rating. The ACS serves as a guide for both applicants and examiners as to how the ride will be conducted and the standards that must be met to pass the exam. The ACS is divided into several areas of operations designated with Roman numerals, and each of these areas of operations is subdivided into several tasks designated with letters. Some areas of operations or tasks may not be applicable to the certificate or rating you're taking your ride for, so those will be omitted. For example, area of our operations 7, tasks B and C have to do with flying a multi-engine airplane on instruments with one engine and operative, so those won't be included on a single engine instrument check ride. Each task is divided into sections labeled knowledge, risk management, and skills. During the oral portion of the examiner should ask one question from each of these sections. During the practical portion, the knowledge and risk management sections set the expectations of how you demonstrate knowledge of the maneuver and exercise proper risk management before and during your performance of it. The skill section lists criteria you have to meet to consider the maneuver satisfactory, including things like altitudes, speeds, headings, and course deviations. Area of operations 1 and 2 are primarily areas that will be evaluated on the oral portion of the exam, with the rest of the operation being things that, for the most part, will be demonstrated during the practical test, though some of them may come up in the oral as well. The FAA has also moved to using scenario-based training and evaluation, so you can expect the entire check ride to revolve around a scenario that evolves as the check ride progresses. You'll find that most check rides have a pretty standard flow to them, and the instrument ride is no different. You'll start by meeting the examiner, who will likely engage in some brief small talk to help you feel at ease. After this, they'll go over your paperwork and make sure that your photo ID, pilot certificate, and medical are all in order. You'll also have completed an application on the Integrated Airman Certificate and Rating Application System, or IACRA, or the paper form, the 8710. They'll review the application to verify that you meet the general eligibility and aeronautical experience requirements for the rating, which we'll talk about in just a second. They'll also review your logbook and make sure that the hours on the application agree with what's in your logbook and that you have all the endorsements you need to take the check ride. You're also required to take a computer-based knowledge test prior to taking the check ride and pass with a score of at least 70%, so they'll need that report as well. The examiner will view your knowledge test report, and it's pretty likely that they will ask a few questions on any subject areas in which you missed questions on the computer test. They'll also expect you to demonstrate that the aircraft that you're using for the check ride is airworthy, so they may want to see the aircraft logs to make sure all of its required inspections are up to date, and you'll need to be able to show them that all the required documents are on board as well. So let's talk a little bit about the eligibility and aeronautical experience requirements you need to get an instrument rating in the real world. These requirements are listed under FAR 61.65. First, you need to hold at least a private pilot certificate. You cannot get an instrument rating added to a sport pilot or recreational pilot certificate. You can add it to a private pilot certificate or a commercial pilot certificate. And you can also take the instrument and private ride at the same time if you hold a sport pilot or recreational pilot certificate, but I don't know how often that's actually done. You need to be able to speak, read, and understand the English language. Most likely, when you got your student pilot's license or your private pilot license, you probably got an endorsement on, or excuse me, a certification on that license that says English proficient. So that should satisfy that requirement. You need to receive ground training or take a home study course and then pass the required knowledge test with at least a 70% on that score on that test, which we talked about earlier, and you have to bring that report with you to the ride. And then you have to receive and log the required flight or simulator training on instrument procedures that we will talk about here in just a little bit. And you need to log the required aeronautical experience, and then you need to receive an endorsement to take the check ride and then pass the check ride, and that endorsement needs to come from a certified flight instructor with an instrument instructor rating, or a CFI or a CFII. As far as the aeronautical experience required for an instrument rating in the U.S. goes, you need at least 50 hours of cross-country time, and that must include at least 10 hours of cross-country time in airplanes. You need 40 hours of actual or simulated instrument time, and this includes at least 15 hours of instruction from a CFII or CFII, a certified flight instructor with an instrument instructor rating. And that has to include at least 3 hours of training to prepare for the check ride, and the required instrument cross-country training, which we talked about in our instrument cross-country training videos, if you want to check those out. And it also specifies that you have to be trained on air traffic control clearances, instrument approaches, arrivals, departures, and those sorts of things. 20 of those hours of instrument time may be in a flight simulator or flight training device. If the training is conducted under Part 61, this is a regular flight school or a freelance instructor. And 30 hours of instrument time may be in a flight simulator or flight training device if the training is conducted under Part 142, and that is a pilot training center. That's someplace like SimuFlight or Flight Safety, or probably the Redbird training centers now probably count as 142 training centers, so someplace like that. And you'll notice also that we do 40 hours of actual simulated instrument, but only 15 hours have to be with an instructor. So the balance of those hours can be with a safety pilot or in a simulator. And no, Microsoft Flight Simulator does not count as a flight simulator or flight training device. And there are actually devices called basic instrument training devices, or basic aircraft training devices. which I believe you can do 10 hours towards your instrument rating in those, as long as you have an instructor, and they have advanced training devices as well. And as long as those are approved by the FAA, you can do up to 20 hours of instrument in those. And obviously, those are a lot less expensive than actually going out and flying an airplane. Once all the paperwork is done, the check ride will officially begin. Again, the examiner will use a scenario to start the ride. The scenario for our ride will be a two-leg IFR itinerary from Pine Bluff to Kansas City Downtown Airport. The first leg will be from Pine Bluff to Drake Field in Fayetteville, Arkansas. The identifier on that airport is Kilo Fox Yankee Victor. And then the second leg will be from Fayetteville Airport to Kansas City Downtown. The identifier on that airport is Kilo Mike Kilo Charlie. The examiner has stated that we only need to do detailed flight planning for the first leg, but be prepared to answer questions about procedures for the entire route for both legs. With that, you'll go get a weather briefing or receive simulated weather from the examiner and plan your flight. Some examiners may even tell you what the flight scenario will be a few days ahead of time, so you can plan the flight in advance, and all you have to do when you show up is plug in the weather. You'll also be expected to show that the aircraft is within weight and balance limits as you have it loaded for the flight. Once you've completed your flight plan, the examiner will review it for accuracy and then start the questioning session. The line of questions will likely start with your scenario, but the examiner will branch off as necessary to test all the areas of knowledge that are required to be tested. These knowledge areas include pilot qualifications. This will include such things as medical qualifications and recency and currency questions. Weather information. This may include having you decode a weather forecast or a weather report, or giving you weather for your stations and asking you if you need an alternate and if a certain station is a legal alternate. Cross-country flight planning. This will be where you will talk about your flight plan, how much fuel you've planned, whether you have planned an alternate, whether your alternate is legal, and then it will dive into the en route charts, the altitudes, and the airspace. Departures, en route, and arrival operations. This will include questions on departure procedures, standard instrument departures, and standard terminal arrival routes. IFR aircraft systems, so expect questions on basic aircraft instruments and glass cockpits if your aircraft is so equipped. Navigation equipment such as VORs and NDBs if they're equipped in your aircraft, and GPS systems. IFR clearances, they may give you some sample IFR clearances and ask you how you would comply with them. What to do in the event of loss of communications. They may give you a scenario where you're en route and you lose communications and ask what you would do. And then checking instruments and equipment in your post-flight. So let's take a look at some sample questions. Starting with your first leg between Pine Bluff and Fayetteville, what route did you file and why? What altitude did you file and why? What is the minimum altitude that you could fly on this route? What is the maximum altitude you would be comfortable flying this route at, and why? Is there any weather between ourselves and Fayetteville that might force us to take an alternate route? What are your choices for an alternate routing? Are there any conditions such as icing that might also force us to take alternative routes or alternative action? How long is our en route time going to be between Pine Bluff and Fayetteville? Where did you obtain your weather forecast? What are the current forecast winds aloft, and how is that going to affect our en route time? Is there any icing that might affect this flight between these two cities at this time? If so, what are your plans if we encounter icing? How much fuel did you plan for this trip? Do you require an alternate? If so, what did you select as your alternate, and how do you know it's a legal alternate? Based on that, how much fuel do we require, and do we have adequate fuel reserves? Where would you find that information? When you depart Pine Bluff, how would you get your air traffic control clearance? If clearance gives you a hold for release time, what does that mean? If they give you a clearance void time, what does that mean? Is there a departure procedure for Pine Bluff? How do you plan on complying with the departure procedure? Describe how you would depart under IFR from runway 18 and from runway 36. Once you get airborne from Pine Bluff and ATC directs you on course, how are you going to get yourself on course? What radial do we need to fly from the Pine Bluff VOR to get ourselves established on Victor 74 headed to the north? What is designated by this boxed number below the airway? What about this number below the airway designation? What does this number mean on top of the airway? What about this open-headed arrow? What's meant by this symbol right here? At what point on this airway do we need to change from navigating using Pine Bluff VOR to navigating using Little Rock VORTAC? What kind of VOR is this? Tell me everything you can about Pine Bluff VOR using all the information that's available to you on this chart. What does a green airport symbol mean? What does a brown airport symbol mean? What about a blue airport symbol? Tell me everything you can about Fort Smith Regional Airport given the information that's available to you on this chart. What do these blue hatched marks mean over here? What about these hatched marks, the brown hatched marks over here? What about the thick and thin brown lines that are going through this area? What is meant by an open triangle symbol? What's different if the triangle symbol is filled black instead of being open? Once we get established on Victor 534 headed to the northwest, ATC asks us to report crossing Bibbs intersection. What are the different ways that we can use to identify Bibbs intersection? At what point on Victor 534 are we going to change from navigating using Little Rock VOR to using Fort Smith VOR? What's meant by these dotted symbols around Russellville Airport? Tell me everything you can about that nav aid. What's meant by the X attached to the intersection at Hawk intersection? What about the R on Scran intersection? When you arrive in Fayetteville and pick up the ATIS, they are advertising the localizer to runway 16 and the RNAV GPS to runway 16 are in use. The weather is currently reporting a ceiling of 600 feet and a visibility of 1 mile. What approach will you choose to use? Fayetteville reports that their radar is out of service, so you will have to navigate onto the approach on your own. How will you do that? What is the frequency for the localizer approach to runway 16? What is the approach course? What's meant by channel 56? How long is the runway? At what elevation is the touchdown zone elevation? And what is the airport elevation? What does this T mean in the left-hand corner of the remarks? What about the A symbol? Tell me what you can about the notes and how they apply to us. What type of approach lighting is available at this airport? If the approach lighting is out of service, will that affect our minimums? What is the missed approach procedure for this approach? What's meant by this star symbol by the Razorback approach and Drake Tower frequencies? What about CTAF? What about the circled L? What is this number right here? What is the MSA and how does it apply to you? What is the tallest obstacle on this plan view? Why is the localizer box highlighted or bolded? Tell me everything you can about the localizer based on the information you see in this box. How can you identify Elmi intersection? How can you identify Hodge intersection? What is the significance of the Maltese cross? What do the altitudes with the underlines mean? What is the significance of Zabco intersection? What does this bold black V mean? What is the significance of the Fayetteville 1.2 DME from the localizer? What are the minimums that you will use on the approach? Do you plan to fly this approach as a traditional dive and drive type approach, or are you going to fly it as a continuous descent final approach? If you're going to utilize it as a continuous descent final approach, tell me how you plan to do that. What does the D mean in the airport plan view here? What does this symbol mean? What does the P mean at the end of the runway? Where is the rotating beacon located on the field? What type of runway lighting does this airport have on this runway? What does the bold C in the circling minimums mean? What are the circling minimums for this approach for your aircraft? And how would you plan to circle? What restrictions are placed upon you if you decide to do this as a circling approach? If you elect to fly the RNAV GPS approach to runway 16, tell me what WAS means. What does this channel number mean? Take a look at the notes and see if there are any notes that apply to us. If so, how does it change the approach for us? If we need to get ourselves established on the approach without the help of air traffic control, how will we do so? What are our options? Can we get vectors onto the approach? If so, where should we expect to get vectors to? How would you fly this approach? What are the different minimum that are described in the minimum categories, and what would be the minimums for our aircraft, assuming different states of operation, such as LPV, LNAV only, or LNAV plus V? Let's change the scenario up and say that when we pick up the ATIS inbound to Fayetteville, they advertise that the LDA to runway 34 is in use. What is an LDA approach? What frequency is the nav aid for this approach on? What is the course of this approach? Does this approach have a glide slope? Tell me how you would fly this approach. Can I intercept the glide slope if I'm receiving it from WATUG and track it down? Does this approach have a decision altitude or a minimum descent altitude? How do we fly this approach if the glide slope is inoperative? What is meant by these numbers down here? Describe how you would fly the missed approach procedure and when it would be appropriate to execute the missed approach procedure. Let's look at the second leg from Fayetteville up to Kansas City downtown. We'll assume that you filed via Victor Airway to Springfield and then filed the Tiger 7 arrival into Kansas City. What's designated by these blue dashed circles here? What about this solid blue circle up here? What about the solid empty blue circle up around Kansas City? If you have filed this approach from Springfield utilizing the Springfield transition, what's the minimum altitude that you can fly at? Describe how you would fly this procedure if Kansas City is landing south. Describe how you would fly the procedure if Kansas City is landing to the north. When we receive the ATIS for Kansas City downtown, it advertises that the ILS to runway 4 is in use. What are the minimums that we'll use for our aircraft to fly this approach? What if the glide slope is inoperative? What minimums will we use then? Why is there a separate set of minimums for WIC 2 fix? Assuming that we are flying the full ILS and they're advertising weather of 200-foot ceiling and 1 mile visibility, are we legal to begin the approach? What if they're advertising a ceiling of 200 feet and half a mile visibility? What if we receive that report after we intercept the glide slope? What if that's the visibility when we break out? What do you need to be able to descend below decision height to a landing as you complete this approach? What's indicated by the lightning bolt symbol on the profile view? What's indicated by these symbols cutting across the runway on each of the runways here. Much like the private pilot oral exam, the instrument oral exam typically lasts about an hour, and you generally won't move on to the practical portion if you don't pass the oral. Once the question session is over, it's time to go flying. The examiner could observe your pre-flight, though this is probably less common on an instrument ride than it is on a private pilot ride, and then it's time to get going. The skills that are required to be tested during an instrument check ride per the ACS are IFR clearances. This could take the form of the examiner issuing you a kind of sample clearance of what you would actually get in real life, or you may actually have to call up air traffic control and get your actual IFR clearance that you did on your cross-country flight. The instrument flight check, so they do expect you to do your flight check as your instrument check as you taxi out for departure. Departure, en route, and arrival operations. This will be tested at the airport that you depart from, and then, of course, en route, they'll have you intercept an airway or see that you can track a GPS appropriately, and then the arrival operations will be tested at your airport that you're going to be doing your instrument approaches at. Instrument flight, just your basic instrument flying skills. Can you keep it straight and level, do turns, climbs, and descents, and fly at approach speeds? That's pretty much going to be evaluated during the entire ride as you're doing your en route flight to the airport you'll do your approaches at, and as you do the approaches, the holds, and those sorts of things. They're required to see holding procedures. They may stick this in as a missed approach. It may be published, it may be unpublished, or they could just do it en route. They're required to see recovery from unusual flight attitudes, typically one nose low and one nose high. So generally they will usually do this towards the beginning of the ride where they'll break off from the route that you are on to demonstrate your cross-country skills and give you a couple of unusual attitudes. They'll just have you close your eyes. They'll maneuver the airplane into an unusual attitude and then say, look up and recover. And then you will move on. Intercepting and tracking of navigational systems and arcs will generally be done. You're going to be doing a lot of intercepting and tracking of navigational systems just on the approach, and if you do any portion of the cross-country flight, then they will see all that they need to see there. They can ask for a DME arc. They might ask for a DME arc if there is a DME arc to an approach that you can use. If there is not, they are not required to test that. They may just ask you about it on the oral. They're required to do non-precision approaches. We'll talk more about the details in that here in just a little bit. Basically, they're required to do two, one with all your instruments and one with your primary instruments and operative. They're required to see you do one precision approach. Typically, this will be an ILS, although they can also sub in a GPS approach that has the LPV capability to substitute for an ILS if there's not an ILS in the vicinity of where you're taking your check ride from. They also have to see, again, that approach with the loss of primary flight instrument indicators. They also need to see a circling approach. So one of your approaches will be a circle to land. They need to see a missed approach procedure. So one of your approaches will terminate that way. And then they need to see you land from an instrument approach. If you're flying a multi-engine airplane, which is pretty rare to do your initial instrument ride in a multi-engine airplane, they're also going to need to see a one-engine and operative instrument flight, so just that you can handle the airplane on instruments with one engine and operative. And they will also need to see a one-engine inoperative instrument approach and landing. Typically, they will do this with an ILS. Again, most people don't get their instrument rating in a multi-engine airplane. Most people will get the instrument rating and then get the multi-engine add-on or get the multi-engine rating after that. And you will, if you are instrument rated to have instrument privileges on your multi-engine certificate, you will have to demonstrate one instrument approach with one engine and operative. The examiner is provided a great deal of discretion in how these skills are tested and in what order. The bottom line, as far as what they're going to probably conduct on the check ride, is that they will need to see you fly at least 3 instrument approaches. They must see one precision approach, and you usually can do this with all of your instruments. They have to see at least 2 non-precision approaches. Each non-precision approach must use a different type of navigational aid, so you can't do 2 GPS approaches. One must be flown using a procedure turn or a terminal arrival area procedure. So in other words, you cannot get vectors onto one of them. One must be flown without the autopilot and without radar vectors. So one will have to be hand flown. And one must be flown with a loss of primary instrument indicators or partial panel. And so typically they will combine this all into one approach where you'll have to fly that one approach without your autopilot and without your primary instruments because your autopilot won't work if you don't have your primary instruments, generally speaking. The examiner has to see you land from an instrument approach, generally straight in. They have to see you circle to land from an instrument approach, and then they just need to see you execute a missed approach procedure. So since you have 3 approaches, your approaches will, each one of each approach will terminate in one of these ways. So you'll do one where you land straight in, one where you circle to land, and one where you execute a missed approach. Typically, they'll do the missed approach first, then the circle to land typically, and then the straight in landing last, but that doesn't necessarily have to go that way. They also have to see holding procedures and recovery from unusual flight attitudes during the course of the ride, but where they put that is completely up to them. They can do the holding procedures as part of a missed approach procedure, or they can do it en route. They can use a published hold, or they can use an unpublished hold. So that can come at any point during the ride. And then the recovery from the unusual flight attitudes typically comes right after they've seen that your basic proficiency in instrument flying is okay. Once you've demonstrated that, usually they'll break off and they will do the unusual the recovery from unusual flight attitudes. As far as the standards go for the ride, we've talked about them as we've done each approach. So each approach has their own standards, but the general guidelines for the entire check ride are going to be that during en route flying and prior to your final approach fix on an approach, you maintain your altitude plus or minus 100 feet, maintain your heading plus or minus 10 degrees, maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and then accurately track radials, courses, and bearings. This generally means not letting the course deviation indicator go to full scale deflection, or if you're using a bearing pointer for something like an ADF, making sure it doesn't go any more than 10 degrees off the intended course. From the final approach fix to either decision altitude or the missed approach point, depending on whether you're shooting a precision or non-precision approach, they expect to see a stabilized approach. Generally, they don't want to see an excessive rate of descent. Allow no more than 3/4 scale deflection of the lateral or vertical course guidance if you have vertical course guidance. Maintain your approach airspeed plus or minus 10 knots. If you decide to do a dive and drive type descent, they want to see you maintain the MDA plus 100 feet and minus 0 feet, meaning you cannot go even 1 foot underneath the MDA. Immediately initiate the missed approach if you arrive at the decision altitude or the missed approach point. And then if they tell you that you have the runway in sight, transition to a visual approach using a normal rate of descent and normal maneuvering. Again, every maneuver has its own criteria, so make sure you look at the particular maneuver that you're trying to become proficient at to know if you have reached proficiency, but these are kind of the general standards for most of the en route flying and most of the approaches that you're going to fly on the check ride. They also do say that if the outcome of any task is in doubt, the examiner can ask to see it again. So if you're kind of right on the edge of the standards, they can ask you to do it again to see if you get it in the middle of the standards. But it does clarify that this is not something where you can go and practice it or get basically a second chance. It's something where you were very, very close, but they're not quite sure if you were going to keep it in the standards or not. So they want to see you do it a little cleaner. And so they'll ask you to do it again. But they do say if you have not performed attached to standards, you should be issued a notice of disapproval that the task was not satisfactory and that you have failed the check ride. A general note about autopilot usage during the instrument check ride. If the aircraft is equipped with an autopilot, generally you can assume that you can use it unless you're told by the examiner that you cannot. The use of the autopilot is generally not required. If you don't want to use it, you certainly don't have to, though it is the possibility that the examiner may want to see you use it if it's in the airplane to show that you are proficient if the aircraft is equipped with one, particularly if it's a complex autopilot. And then one of the two non-precision approaches must be flown without the use of the autopilot, and typically that is going to be the partial panel approach. So let's take a look at an example of how this ride could be conducted using the scenario we've discussed. Prior to your oral exam, you filed the flight plan for your first leg. The examiner asked you to put a remark in the flight plan that this is an instrument check ride and that the flight will terminate in Little Rock with multiple approaches. He also informs you that you'll ask ATC for 4,000 as a final cruise altitude rather than the 8,000 feet you filed because of the minimum altitudes on the later part of the route, which you're not going to get to. After you ace the oral exam, you perform your pre-flight and hop in the airplane. The examiner asks you to get your clearance for your IFR flight before you take off from Pine Bluff. As you taxi out, they expect to see you perform your pre-departure instrument checks. On takeoff, they expect to see you follow the appropriate departure procedure as you leave the airport environment, as well as making the appropriate calls to the Common Traffic Advisory frequency and checking in with air traffic control. Once checked in with ATC, they clear you direct to Pine Bluff VOR and tell you to resume your own navigation, so you can proceed direct to the VOR and track the airway outbound towards Little Rock. They also tell you to climb and maintain 4,000, which they have made your final cruise altitude per your requests. Once you get leveled off and the examiner is confident in your basic instrument flying and navigation skills, they request permission from ATC to maneuver VFR for a few minutes to the east of the airway. They ask you to close your eyes and put your head down while they maneuver into some unusual attitudes for you to recover from. Typically, there will be two of these, one nose low and one nose high, but don't let what happened before or happened first lull you into a false sense of security in that you know what maneuver is coming next. Once you've successfully completed the unusual attitude, it's time for the barrage of approaches to begin. They tell you to request vectors to the ILS to runway 4 right at Little Rock. You set up for and brief the approach. The examiner tells you to request an amended missed approach instruction to make a right turn direct to Little Rock VOR and then to hold southeast of the Little Rock VOR on the 139-degree radial inbound with right turns. Wonder what approach is coming next. You request the approach and are approved for your requested missed approach procedure. You then get vectors onto the localizer and get cleared for the ILS to runway 4 right. You fly your best ILS approach, keeping both needles in the center to decision height, but at decision height, alas, the examiner says, nothing in sight. You execute the missed approach and enter the hold at Little Rock VOR, which counts as both your hold and your procedure turn for the next approach. After a few turns in the hold, the examiner directs you to ask for clearance for the VOR Alpha, circle to land runway 36 at Little Rock. The controller tells you that you're cleared for the approach on your next inbound turn. You diligently descend to the platform altitude on the inbound leg, configure your aircraft, and descend to the MDA after you cross the VOR. About a mile from the field, the examiner calls the runway in sight and directs you to circle to a full stop landing on runway 36. You get to catch your breath for a little bit as you taxi back to runway 36. The examiner informs you that you'll take off and head back to Pine Bluff under VFR, though you will be under the hood. And at Pine Bluff, with a calm wind, you can plan to fly the RNAV GPS to runway 18 straight in with no procedure turn. Once airborne and free to navigate, the examiner tells you to proceed direct to WAG waypoint for the approach. Unfortunately, they also inform you en route that your primary flight display has failed as they cover it up, and informs you that the display won't consolidate and lets you know that your autopilot also does not seem to be working anymore. Despite these setbacks, you're able to use your backup instruments and the remaining displays to fly the RNAV approach. As you approach the minimums for the approach, the examiner reports the field in sight, and you complete a full stop landing and taxi to the ramp for shutdown and to obtain your new temporary certificate with an instrument airplane rating. Just like with a temporary private pilot certificate, your temporary certificate with your instrument rating allows you to fly under IFR as pilot in command immediately as you await your permanent certificate's arrival by mail. Having the instrument rating in your pocket opens up all public use airspace for your use, including Class A airspace above 18,000 feet in the US if you're flying a turbocharged, turboprop, or jet aircraft. It also allows you to make more consistent use of your aircraft as a transportation tool and allows you greater flexibility in how you plan and execute your flights. You'll find flight planning can be a little simpler if you don't have to worry about punching through a cloud, and many pilots choose to fly IFR if flying across country, even in good weather, just for the extra safety margin. Many pilots also find that learning to fly on instruments makes them a better pilot, flying with more precision and finesse. Becoming an instrument pilot also makes transitioning to larger and more complex equipment a little easier and allows you full access to their capabilities. Most commercial operators, including most corporate flight departments and almost all commercial airlines, operate almost exclusively under instrument flight rules. So if your goal is to fly a heavy jet or even a small one, becoming a proficient instrument pilot is a must. Having knowledge and proficiency with instrument flying in Flight Simulator allows you to take full advantage of more flying opportunities and fly more types of aircraft, and to participate more fully on virtual ATC services like VATSIM. And Flight Sim makes for an excellent tool for both beginners and experienced instrument pilots to practice their instrument flying skills. That concludes this video, and this video concludes our instrument training series. Hopefully this video has given you a good idea of what it takes to earn an instrument rating in the real world, and hopefully the entire series has given you the knowledge and skills you need to become proficient at and fully enjoy instrument flying in the sim. Again, if you've enjoyed the video, be sure to actuate that like button, share the video with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Looking forward on the channel, as we all eagerly await the release of Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, you can look forward to some in-depth tutorials on the aircraft in the new sim, as well as the sim itself. I'll be doing some tutorials as well on more advanced aircraft systems, such as constant speed props, retractable landing gear, turbochargers, pressurization, and turbine engines. And of course, I'll be doing some more of the avionics tutorials that you all know and love so well. Thank you again for your continued support of the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.